As they passed the 2.5 mile mark, Ulbrichtsen had begun to slump in his seat. He stopped chewing his gum. What on earth was Mock doing? Why in God's name didn't he turn them loose? Tom Bowles and George Pocock sat up, looking morose. It's starting to look like a case of suicide. In the boat, Bobby Mock took a long look at the 4 lengths between his bow and the California's stern, and hollered to the boys facing him, "Okay, you lugs, we're 1 length behind." A roar went up as the crowds near the finish line began to see the leaders. Navy was neck and neck with Cal, and the two of them seemed to be running away with it. With a mile to go, Washington still nearly 3 lengths back, the boys were rowing as if in some kind of trance now. There was little sound out in the middle of the river except for Mock's chanting, the rattle of oars and oarlocks, and their deep rhythmic breathing, and their pulses pounding in their ears. There was almost no pain. In the number 5 seat, Stub McMillan realized with astonishment that he was still breathing easy through his nose. On the train, Ulbrichtsen muttered, "They're overplaying their hand. They'll be lucky to finish third." His face had gone white. Then suddenly, Bobby Mock leaned into Dom Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Ulbrichtsen." 8 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then another lie. "Here's California. We're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." Very slowly, the Husky Clipper slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. On the train, someone called out, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" All eyes shifted from the leaders to the 8 white blades barely visible in the middle of the river. Another roar rose from the crowd. "It seems impossible for Washington to close the gap. They are a half-mile from the finish and 2 lengths back." On the boat, Mock barked, "Okay, now, now, now!" Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell behind him, just as smooth as silk. The boys began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past Navy oarsmen as their shell was pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain glanced over his shoulder. For the first time since he'd left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up from behind him. He bellowed at his crew to pick it up. Mock hollered at Hume to take the Washington rate up another notch. The two boys careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectators' boats. With the finish line looming ahead, Bobby Mock screamed. Suddenly, nobody could understand. Johnny White in the number 4 seat suddenly had the sensation that they were flying. Shorty Hunt still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his new field of view. He kept the boy's eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled his heart again. Joe had boiled everything down to one action, one continuous movement, one thought. The crew's mantra was running through his mind like a river, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp English accent. MIB, MIB, mind in boat. On the train, Al Ulbrichtsen stared silently at the scene unfolding in front of him. A Seattle sports writer began to holler, "Come on, Washington, come on!" Another writer shoved his paper-press badge to his mouth and began to devour it. Tom Bowles was jumping up and down, beating the fellow in front of him with his lucky old fedora. Then, in the last 200 yards, Payne suddenly came shrieking behind the boat, searing the boys' legs, their arms and shoulders, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped for air. In those last 200 yards, an extraordinary burst of speed, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat. By this time, the two boats had crossed the line. A glimmer of open water showed between the bow of Cal's boat and the stern of the Husky Clipper. Watching from the train, Ulbrichtsen resumed chewing his gum. George Pocock threw back his head and howled. The sports writer removed his chewed up remains of his press badge from his mouth. Tom Bowles continued beating the man in front of him with his lucky fedora, and in the boat, the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. When reporters approached Ulbrichtsen, he stood up and said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." Then he added, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." Later, when they got back to the shell house, the boys found hundreds of excited fans waiting for them. They climbed out of the Husky Clipper and followed another rowing tradition, threw coxswain Bobby Mock into the Hudson to the delight of the spectators. After retrieving him from the water, they forced their way through the crowd into the building. Ulbrichtsen climbed onto a bench. The boys, clutching jerseys they had collected from the losing crews, sat on the floor around him. After a few remarks to all the rowers, proclaiming that every son and daughter of Washington was proud of them, he addressed the varsity. Never in history has a crew given a more gallant, game fight to win the most coveted rowing honor at the stake of his country than that varsity did today. And I can only say to you that I am proud and happy." He paused and looked around the room and then concluded, "I never expected to see a better rowed race." Then he stepped down. Nobody cheered. Nobody stood up and applauded. Everybody sat silently, soaking in the moment. On the stormy night, on January 1935, the Ulbrichtsen had first started talking openly about going to the Olympics. Everyone had stood and cheered. But then it seemed like a dream. Now they were on the verge of actually making it happen. Cheering somehow seemed dangerous.